Seeing none, is there any other honourable wishing to speak on the bill? Honourable Member for Calgary Glenmore.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege this evening to be able to get up and to speak to what I wish was actually a bill of some importance. It's somewhat amazing to me as we see this 41-year-old tired and worn-out government that doesn't have any new and innovative ideas comes up with a bill like this called Bill 1, Result-Based Budgeting Act. And everyone that I talk to about this can't believe it and say, well, if they're going to start doing results-based budgeting, what have they been doing for the last previous 4 budgets when they've ran deficits? I was just looking in my office tonight, Mr. Speaker, where I had the sun, and there was the Premier sitting on a pot of red ink, and it was the red Stelmach budget, the 4th deficit. I thought he's no longer in the House. Did he not resign? I apologize. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Someone told me that he'd resigned and... Hey, well, you guys, you have so many things happening over there, and it'd be the honourable thing to actually do if you're not going to... So anyways, what we have here is a government that has a major problem on balancing its budget, and so they think they need to put up some smoke and mirrors as if Albertans are going to buy this, and they're going to say they're going to start doing result-based budgeting. It's an insult to Albertans, because the result of this government's budgeting has been 5 deficit budgets in a row. I find it interesting to listen to them talk about the great investments that they're going to make and how wonderful and the opportunity that they have going forward, but yet the only thing that we see going forward is an escalation of spending that's going to result of us cycling back to the period of 1992, where this government ran into a $23 billion debt that we had to take some major steps. But probably what's most concerning, Mr. Speaker, on this is the fact that the world is different today than it was in '92. Today we see around the world many governments that are on the brink of bankruptcy and failure because of this exact type of thinking that deficit budgets are okay. That it's okay to spend. I mean, they have this idea that, oh, we got to spend during the tough times, but we even have to spend more during the good times. And so when do we ever balance it? It's interesting, when I saw the Premier's brochure that was dropped off at my home in Calgary, it says one of the things that we want to do is to save more for future Albertans. Well, how does this budget, how does this bill, Bill 1, Result-Based Budgeting Act, save anything for Albertans? It doesn't even save us from the embarrassment of having all of the revenue, record revenue, and having to say that we can't balance our budget yet. But it's okay. In 2 years from now, we're going to have $6 billion worth of surplus. How many times do we see individuals talk, companies talk, CEOs talk, when they're in financial distress, that, oh, 2 years down the road, the pot of gold is there. We just need to make it 2 years, when we don't have the discipline to balance our budget at this time. But again, the honourable member from Edmonton Strathcona said that the Premier seems to be confused on what's result-based budgeting or zero-based budgeting. And I guess I'd like to talk just a little bit about zero-based budgeting. There's some advantages. I'm a believer in zero-based budgeting. But the disadvantage, many say, is that it's very time-consuming, and you have to go through every year the reasons why you're doing something. Again, showing the results. Why do we need to spend $1 billion in agriculture again? And so you go through the line items and you say, well, do we need to cover off, on this insurance policy, or do we need to put more money into this research? And you actually go through the process of asking, should this be continued the next year? And I think that zero-based budgeting is something that should always be in the back of one's mind, even if you're not actually doing it. but to go through and ask the questions, is this the right thing to be spending our money on? Does this fit our criteria? Is this to be prioritized? Because let's face it, there's so many things in the world today, there's always the opportunity to spend more money. But the question is how are we going to spend the money that we do have, and are we going to prioritize it right? And so zero-based budgeting gives one that opportunity, but yet the question is, well, what has this government been doing? If it isn't zero-based budgeting, it's just incremental budgeting. And so all that you really need to do is to justify why you need to increase the budget. And perhaps you might say, well, IT has said that we need to upgrade our programming, and that's expensive, and therefore we need to increase our IT, by 25%. And we look at these incremental increases with the thought that, well, we wouldn't have spent any money poorly last year, so we'll just look at anything where we need to have the increases. But zero-based budgeting takes us back to that question and having to justify each and every expenditure on a line-item basis. And I believe that Albertans expect that from their government. They want every dollar spent wisely. They want to have a priority list. And I think it's another area where this government insults Albertans, and my colleague was earlier talking about schools and whether or not that list should be made public. I'm always amazed when the government members over there say, oh no, that would just be politics. And people would be upset and fighting if they actually knew, which schools were at the top of the priority list. Heavens, they act like Albertans don't understand that if a school in Beaumont is at 140% capacity versus one that's at 70%, do we need more there? I still remember that day when they saw children in Beaumont carrying their desks across the road to get to the other classes. This government has failed on how they're prioritizing their budgeting. They can't even do it on an incremental one, but the government has decided, and the Premier, that we don't want to go with zero-based budgeting. What we want is results-based budgeting. And that's very generic and even more embarrassing, in my opinion, as an Albertan, to say that, our budgets is results-based. When you read through this very short bill, and I must say that brevity is always a bonus, but it doesn't say a lot on what those results are going to be. The results of our budgeting is going to ensure that we don't have over a 10% deficit. We're not going to expand. It doesn't even explain what the results the government is looking for, other than they say that next year, we're going to go through everything. Well, if there was anything to go through since last October when they took over, they went through the budget, and yet they come forward and say, we can't make any cuts. This Premier has said many times that there will be zero cuts. We don't need to cut, but yet we need to expand. We need to increase our spending, and we need to increase government. Just operational alone, 6.9% increase in operations. This is an area with our alternative budget that we put out, said, well, no, we'll cap it at 2.5%, and I believe it was a $1.6 billion savings by just reducing the operating. Those are the type of things that result-based budgeting should reflect. We need to be able to see what are going to be the results of cutting back in this area? What are the results of reducing the management and moving $800 million from management into frontline workers? What are the results, if we go through an attrition program for the next 4 years and remove those top-end managers? What are the results if we actually built 3,000 beds for our seniors so they can get out of the hospitals and into long-term care, as opposed to keeping them in the hospital, clogging up 50% of our acute care beds? The government never talks about those things. They pontificate about it. They don't show the results. And if they had the results, one would surely think that they would be astute enough to realize that, if we refocus our money, if we refocus these dollars on frontline teachers, on senior caregivers, on police officers, in in doctors and nurses and in equipment for diagnosing medical conditions, what would be the results? If we were to increase, the amount of operating time for doctors so they could get in and do the cataracts, do the hips, do the knees, what would be the results? And I just truly think that this government didn't even stumble upon it when they put results-based budgeting on their Bill 1 to think that, could our results be any better? Could we balance the budget this year? It's been clearly that the result of their thinking is that no, there's nothing to do any better. This is as good as it can be. That this is what we want to do, to go to Albertans and say, a $3.1 billion cash deficit for the 5th year in the row, a totaling of close to $16 billion, is the results of this government's thinking on how to balance the books. It's very disappointing, it's very concerning, and one has to ask, where are we going to be 6 months from now? We need to do better, Mr. Speaker. This government needs to do better. That if they don't, the results are going to be that we're going to have to make drastic cuts in areas that we don't want to. Those core services in our health care, in our education, in our policing, in necessary infrastructure is going to be compromised in a few short years because this government insists on using a sustainability fund for unsustainable spending. It's not in the best interest of Albertans. It seems like the only interest is to say, well, if we spend enough money, people will vote for us. And so we need to have a budget that gives to all. No one can criticize it, but the fiscal conservatives Albertans, they are criticizing this. They say that this isn't acceptable. They still remember the drastic cuts that were needed to be taken in order to get out of debt. And for this Premier and Cabinet to say that, well, we're not in debt, well, they're running a deficit. The money that they spend is short $3.1 billion, I believe, of the dollars and the revenue that they're taking in. That's the result of this budget, which this government just brought down last week. It's not in our best interest. We have an opportunity here to make some changes in the next 20 days or so and say, let's make some cuts. Let's look at those areas that aren't cost effective. Why are we subsidizing industries? Why are we putting $2 billion into carbon capture and sequestration? What's the results of that? Shortage of hospital beds, shortage of nurses, shortage of teachers, shortage of teaching assistants, shortage of operations, hips, knees, cataracts. The results is that we are not addressing those things with much higher priority, whereas we're focusing on, the cotton candy, the fluff, the sugary things, hoping that it's sweet enough that they'll be able to get a majority government and to come booming back. And then, Mr. Speaker, say, let's talk about taxes. We have a problem here. The results of our overspending now have us in a position where taxes need to go up. Why didn't we think of that? I'm amazed that they want to bring in this Bill 1, results-based budgeting, and yet they have so much referral to that after this next election we need to have a discussion because the revenue is too volatile coming from our resources to be able to be dependent on it. And so we need to talk about how we're going to shore up the revenue that we can be, they seem to say that more stable funding, but we have record revenue and they're not able to, what's that? No. They have record revenue, but yet they have even a higher record of spending. And they want to say that, this is the best for Alberta, that they're investing in the future, they're investing in people, when I would say it's just the opposite. What they're doing is that they're going to be taxing future generations. They're going to put them in a situation where they will not be able to recover from this. The world, when you look out there, it's in a very precarious situation right now. be interesting here the next few days to see what happens in Greece on whether they sign on to an austerity program and agree that they can't keep spending that much, or whether they break away from the euro and have their own currency again. And then we'll see the repercussions of that, the devaluation that will go forward in order to monetize their debt out.
Standing Order 29-2A.